So today we're going to be talking about looking at aspects in the birth chart. And we've chosen Sinead O'Connor's birth chart. The reason that we chose this chart is only because it shows all the major aspects. It's typically you won't find all the major aspects in one birth chart, but she has that. So that's why we chose this chart to look at. We're not doing a chart interpretation of Sinead O'Connor. We're going to be talking about looking at the different aspects in the birth chart. So Kevin, can you just, I guess, give us a basic definition of the word aspects? And the other thing that I'm hoping you can explain is the difference between major aspects and minor aspects. Today, we're just talking about major aspects, but minor aspects are a term that comes up that I think can lead to confusion as people are learning astrology.
Yeah, so aspects are how any two or more planets are linked energetically through their angular relationships. And so if you imagine there's 360 degrees in a circle, and so that's what an astrology chart is, a circle. You can divide that circle by one would be, so the conjunction would be right next to when two planets or the sun and the moon are right next to each other. Typically within 10 degrees is kind of the standard amount of degrees that is allowed to be still considered a conjunction or any aspect, not any aspect, but for some aspects at least. So that term, which is referring to the amount of degrees which is being allowed for it to still be considered a proper aspect, is referred to as an orb. And so different websites and different astrologers use different orbs or a number of degrees from which they would still consider it an aspect legitimate or proper. And so an aspect is simply referring to when the sun, the moon, or a planet, to any of those are connected energetically. And so they can be connected. The primary connection would then be a conjunction when the two celestial bodies are next to each other. So here in Sinead O'Connor's chart, you see a number of conjunctions. You see over in the first house, the sun and Venus are conjunct. In her 12th house, you have Mercury, Neptune, and the South Node are conjunct. And then over at the top of her chart, you have Mars, Uranus, and Pluto are conjunct. So I guess Mars and Uranus are conjunct, and Uranus is also conjunct Pluto. If you're allowing 10 degrees, and then over in her 12th house, the South Node would be conjunct Neptune. It's within 10 degrees. And then Neptune would also then be conjunct Mercury. So that would be the most important aspect, the most significant. Two planets are right next to each other. They are linked energetically. So their energies are going to be blended in some sort of a way that the one carries the energy of the other and vice versa. So in this case, the energy of her sun would also then carry the energy of Venus, and the energy of Venus would also carry the energy of her sun. To some extent, Venus is still what Venus is, the sun is still what it is, but it's colored by the energy of that which it's conjunct to. So that is the most significant conjunction. In my opinion, everything comes like that. That's the place to start. And
I think, sorry to interrupt you, Kevin, but I think just as people are learning astrology, I think the layman's term to conjunction is right next to. So it means
yes, next
the two bodies are right next to each other. And an opposition is opposing. So
yes. So then the next most important one. So we're going to go in order of what I understand to be the most significant and impactful. So then the next most important would be the opposition. It's exactly what it sounds like. The two planets are opposite. So in Sinead O'Connor's chart, Saturn is opposite Pluto and Uranus. And it's also within 10 degrees of opposition to Mars. So it, allowing a 10-degree orb would be considered opposite all three of those planets. So the opposition is going to be indicated by a red line. It's going to be the longer of red lines. And so now when we're getting into the aspects, we're dividing the circle by different numbers. So in this case, the circle has been divided by 2. It's 180 degrees, give or take 10 degrees. So the opposition is, you could think about these two planets are now linked in a polarized dynamic. Typically, there's a certain level of tension or difficulty that comes with seeking to balance these like opposite polarities. So that would be the primary indication of planets being linked in a way that would be considered like a hard aspect. That's part of the term. One of the commonly used terms is the opposition as well as the square would be considered hard aspects, indicated by a red line. And then the blue lines would indicate what would be considered a soft or harmonious aspect. So the next would be the trine. Now we've divided the circle by 3. So these would be planets that are 120 degrees apart. Typically, the trine would indicate 2 planets that are in signs of the same elements. If you allow 10 degrees, or they're not always in the same sign of the same element. So in this chart, Saturn would be trine to Mercury and Neptune. They're both in water signs, Saturn in Pisces, Mercury and Neptune in Scorpio. So in the trine, these are considered harmonious. They're typically in the same elements. So the idea is that being of the same elements, they have a similar nature, and they kind of work in a way that is compatible. And so the energies now are linked. So we're not going to get into interpretations and how to interpret what this connection of an opposition or a trine or anything else actually means, but you can begin thinking about, what does Mercury mean? What does Neptune mean? And how would those energies then blend with Saturn in a way that's harmonious? So, you take the definition of Saturn, of principles of discipline and hard work and things like that, and Mercury, how you process information and communicate, and perhaps those two would blend in a way that, you could say the way she thinks and communicates is somehow reflects that Saturn-like energy. Next, we're going to get to dividing the circle by 4, which would be the square. In general, I would say the trine and the square are probably of equal strength or energy. However, the squares tend to be more noticeable than the trines because we tend to notice tension is just more noticeable. When people have some sort of problem or dysfunction, it's much easier to see than when something is working well. So in her chart, you have the square, you have the Sun and Venus are square to Saturn, as well as to Pluto and Uranus. So now the square carries a similar quality to the opposition in that it's considered a hard aspect. And when you're first starting to learn about this stuff, it's perhaps easier to just think about it as more or less the same thing. The 2 planets are linked in a way that's going to be challenging and dynamic. They're not exactly the same, and if you choose to continue to learn more in depth, there's definitely distinctions to be made between the 2. But in the beginning, I don't recommend really trying to go into the difference between a square and an opposition. It's just easier to think, okay, these planets are linked. And in general, when you're looking at the birth chart, one of the things I would suggest, perhaps the first place to start, or one of the first places to start, would be to look at aspects to the sun and the moon, or the sun and the moon. So in this case, the sun is square to Pluto and Uranus and Saturn. And so the sun's energy is linked to Venus by conjunction and to Saturn, Pluto, and Uranus by square. And so that is more than enough information to ponder and to evaluate. And the connection to Venus, or to Venus, is not necessarily harmonious or challenging. It's just, and it's going to be more prominent, being that it's a conjunction. So conjunction is considered more neutral, toward the square and the opposition are considered hard or challenging. And the trine, as well as the sextile, which we're going to talk about next, would be considered harmonious. So now we're going to skip dividing the circle by 5. That would be what's considered a minor aspect, which we'll talk about after this. And we're going to divide the circle by 6. And that takes us to the sextile, which would be two planets, or the sun and the moon, being 60 degrees apart. Most charts, or programs that will pull up your chart, use a different orb for the sextile. Typically, the trine, the opposition, and the square use a 10-degree orb, and sextiles typically allow for a 6-degree orb. Not exactly sure why that is, but I do trust the people who've created these programs that are very experienced astrologers, and they found that seems to hold up in their interpretations. So the sextile, in the beginning, you should think about it as similar to a trine. The difference between the trine and the sextile is that the sextile, it's not going to be the same element. If it is a proper sextile within, the proper signs, earth and water would go together, fire and air would go together. So it's considered harmonious, but some people might say it's a little more dynamic in that they're different elements. They're elements that work together harmoniously. Earth and water are considered the yin or feminine elements, and fire and air would be considered the yang or masculine elements. Something else to also take into consideration is that the hard aspects, so the square and the opposition, are always going to be in the same mode. So in this case, she has the opposition as well as the square coming from mutable signs. So if they're in the proper signs, if they were exact, they would always be coming from two planets that are either both in mutable signs, fixed signs, or cardinal signs. So those are considered the major aspects. I have found in the birth chart that those are the aspects that really do show up in a way that's noticeable and more prominent in the individual's personality. We're going to do a subsequent video about transits, which is then you need to understand what an aspect is in order to understand transits. The rules are a bit different in transits, so we'll get into that when we cover transits. But ultimately, what a transit is when the transiting planet is making an aspect to something in the birth chart. So there's also minor aspects, which would be if you were to divide the circle by 5, by 8, or also 3/8 would be considered a minor aspect. And then there's even more minor aspects if you were to divide the circle by 7 or 9, which those are almost never talked about, though some astrologers do talk about it. The minor aspects that people do sometimes talk about would be if you were to divide the circle by 5, would be 72 degrees, considered a quintile. Or if you were to divide it by 8, would be a semi-square, or 3/8 would be called a sesqui-square or a sesqui-quadrant. We're not going to get into those, but sometimes they're meaningful, sometimes they're not. Like I'll kind of leave it at that. And certainly when you're beginning to learn, I suggest just completely disregarding them. If you continue and you're really going into depth and you want to devote many hours of study to astrology to learn to the extent where you can really do an in-depth interpretation, then learning about the minor aspects is relevant. Though you can still do a very meaningful interpretation without considering them at all.
Yeah, I think when you, just to make an analogy, I think like when you're thinking about maybe cooking, it's kind of like, the planets, the signs, the houses, the aspects are kind of like the flour, sugar, water.
Yeah, salt and pepper.
Yeah.
Right?
And then I think the minor aspects, obviously, as you continue to learn astrology, but that's more kind of like this, maybe some spices that you're putting in that you can kind of, as you continue to layer the chart. But there was one other thing that I just wanted to, we talked about the orbs, and I think it is a very important concept to understand. So just to kind of give an example in Sinead O'Connor's chart, like if we're talking about a 10-degree orb, she has her sun at 15 degrees of Sagittarius. So you could go up to 20, am I doing the math right? 25 degrees, or you could, if you did less than 10 degrees, you'd be at 5 degrees of Sagittarius.
Correct.
So that would be an orb of,
anything between 5 degrees of Sagittarius and 25 degrees of Sagittarius in this case would be considered conjunct if it was the sun, the moon, a planet, or the nodes. I just a little teaser. I found that the sun and the moon can as well as the ascendant to have a larger orb, especially with conjunctions. I think most astrologers would agree with that. The sun, the moon, and the ascendant are bigger energies, so their sphere of influence is going to be larger. If you were to really start to go into the weeds of astrology and look at things like asteroids or other things, like the chart could have hundreds of pieces of information. There's stars, there's all sorts of stuff, right? That typically those less significant things that could be plotted on the chart would have much smaller orbs. Like my understanding of astrologers who focus on asteroids allow 1 degree. Certain stars maybe get 2 degrees. I don't really focus on that stuff too much. I'm aware of it, but I haven't felt called to really go in depth with that. So the orbs vary, and different astrologers have different rules. Astrology it's a science and an art, and it's open to interpretation. So one of the things I would also suggest as people go about learning is to think about if 2 planets, especially with the conjunction to the sun or the moon, if this was a conjunction, what would it mean? So in this case, if the energy of Venus was blended with a person's sun, how would that show up in their life and their personality? And that will be a good way to go about learning astrology as far as just looking at the conjunctions to the sun and the moon in your chart, as well as your parents, your children, siblings, significant others, and people you know well.
And I know we're not doing a chart interpretation of Sinead, but just with that statement that you made, I mean, as people are starting to look at their charts, looking at Sinead O'Connor's chart, she has Sun conjunct Venus in Sagittarius in the first house. So would you suggest first looking at the house, then the conjunction, and then the sign it's in? And that would be how you'd begin to interpret that. So like, we know the energy of Sagittarius is kind of this energy of travel and being courageous. And the sun is how we shine our light. And Venus is what we love and what we see beautiful. And again, I don't know Sinead O'Connor personally, but I guess I would think that it's important to her that she shines her light in an authentic way that and she's courageous. And that's really maybe what gives her a feeling of accomplishment and having self-love, since it's in the first house of self-identity.
Yeah.
Again, I know I don't want to interpret her chart, but I'm just to help people start to look at this.
Just the way you're thinking is how I would encourage people to go about learning. Her sun's also conjunct her ascendant. So her ascendant is there at 5 degrees of Sagittarius. So,
and that's sorry to interrupt you again, Kevin, but that's another, the reason that her ascendant is also in Sagittarius is because she was born as the sun was rising. I think.
Yeah, she would have been born right before sunrise if the sun's in the first house. So the 12th house would be right after sunrise.
If her birth chart is accurate.
Assuming that the birth time is accurate. So a little side note about with the ascendant as well as the midheaven or any of the 4 angles, we'll do a separate video about the angles of the chart, which would be the ascendant, midheaven, as well as the 2 points that are opposite that. Typically, only the conjunction is considered for that, though some astrologers do also draw all of the aspects to the ascendant. That's one of those things that astrologers are not in agreement about. And I'm not going to comment even anymore on that, though. What I would encourage you to consider is only the conjunction to the ascendant and the midheaven, as well as perhaps the other angles. So yeah, in this case, the energy of her sun, what the sun means, how you shine your light, how you move out into the world, how you make an impact on the world, is also then going to be blended with what the ascendant means, how you're first received by the world and how you bring your energy into the world.